go ahead and start recording and welcome you all to our very last class. I am somewhat sad and somewhat excited that we are at the very end of our semester. I'm sure that many of y'all feel the same way. Somehow in scheduling, I wound up being done before Thanksgiving for the very first time since teaching this class. So I'm pretty happy with that. I hope that all of you are happy with that. A couple of reminders. Many of you have not yet submitted your individual critical thinking exercises. So obviously the only one left to do is the older adulthood unit. So that is due tomorrow by 11:59 p.m. Central Time. So please do not accidentally forget to submit that and get distracted by other things. I know it's a busy week. Additionally, I wanted to thank all of you. I checked a little while ago and saw that everyone, at least I think everyone, has submitted their group contribution statements for your CTE presentations. Thank you so much for that. I really had thought I was going to be able to get your group grades back before now. Many thousand infinite apologies for that. I know that is probably super frustrating to many, if not all of you, but I promise I will be working on those. Obviously, need to be working on those in the next little bit. I know this is the first semester for most of you, so sometimes it can get confusing about kind of where your grades get posted, so I thought I would just share that with you. The grades that will be posted in Canvas are going to be essentially your final grades, but I do, and I'll put this to you in an announcement as well, but I do, as just a general rule, round up at the 0.5 decimal. So if your total kind of average winds up to be a 94.5, you can make an assumption that I will just round that up to a 95. If it is a 94.49 or below, I will round down, and it just all kind of becomes a wash. So just know that. But Canvas does not represent your final grades. That's just an administrative tool for us to use. So your final grades that will go on your transcript, they're all going to be available to you through the MyUTK system. So you can see everything through there. And I don't even think that we're able to enter grades in there until December 1st. So you don't expect to see those there this week or next week. And then I think the deadline for for entering the grades is December 19th. So somewhere between December 1st and December 19th, you can expect to see your final grades posted there. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, but that's pretty much the procedure that you can expect for all of your classes, but definitely for mine. I think that's all the sort of general announcements I had. Are there any just kind of general questions before we touch base on the content? I hear somebody unmuted. Do you have a question? Steve, do you have a question?
Okay. No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. All right. Everybody, if you can just make sure you mute your lines while we're talking, that'd be great. One last thing. It is really, really, really important to me, and I cannot stress this enough, that each of you fill out the end of semester course evaluations. You should have received a link today. I will also send out probably a couple multiple reminders. The deadline for submitting those course evaluations is December 6th. Those really help me every single year to make improvements to this course. I am really committed to continuous quality improvement, and I cannot make improvements without hearing directly from you. A lot of what you all experienced this semester were kind of course corrections and course changes that I made based on previous students' recommendations and from their course evaluations. So I really do practice what I preach in that area. And I can't express my gratitude enough. Really means a lot for me to get those from you, good, bad, and ugly, whatever it is, as long as it's respectful. Really appreciate it. This semester, I have decided that I'm going for 100% response rate. I know sometimes you get distracted. There's lots going on. You just want to be done and you don't want to fill out that piece, but it really doesn't take that long. So I really hope that you can take just a few minutes to help me out. And of course, you're welcome to email me any feedback you have at any point. If you want to talk to me directly or schedule a call, I'm happy to do that. But again, would love and appreciate your taking the time to fill out those course evaluations. All right. So I was planning to go ahead and do a regular kind of scheduled program. We don't have a group presentation tonight, so it does mean that we have a little bit more time for some of the course content. And I really wanted to, I really wanted to make sure that we had some good time for discussion. This unit, sometimes more than some of the other units, can hit us really hard, can hit us squarely here, especially if we have direct experience with caring for older adults, caring for our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or great aunts and uncles. This is something that is, aging is inevitable. And I realized that when I was watching the Living Old documentary with the students earlier this morning, that I really do book into this course with some really heavy material. We start out with epigenetics, and it's pretty heavy, and then it's all about what did your grandparents eat and how is that affecting you now, and intergenerational transmission of stress and all that, to what does aging and getting old really look like, and especially within our current paradigm and our current kind of Western medicine kind of culture and paradigm that we all exist in and experience on a almost daily basis sometimes. So there's lots of material here. And so I wanted to check in with you all and see if you had any reactions or questions from the Living Old documentary.
It just made me incredibly sad to watch.
Yeah, who's that talking?
It's Hillary.
Oh, hey, Hillary. Yeah,
Hi.
I agree. It makes me sad too. Yeah.
My grandma, she had, she had like a degenerative chronic disease, and you kind of go through like those stages of watching her lose function. And so like, not only was it like her losing physical functions, but then like there was cognitive decline as well. So like it was basically just like watching the show and seeing her the whole time. So it was pretty tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially kind of on the heels of the Sandwich Generation documentary from last week. It really kind of does put everything right in our face. So yeah, I agree. And a lot of, even some of our students in class, there were tears. I'm not gonna lie, there were tears. It really is challenging to watch. What are some other reactions?
I just watched it today, and it was really hard for me to watch as well. It made me think a lot about a personal situation we're dealing with. My father-in-law 3 years ago had a stroke, and he's not even, I think he's 62 this year. And he was he was like a thriving dentist when it happened. We had no warning whatsoever, and he had to retire early. And he was actually the one that was in the better health than my mother-in-law was, and now she's taking care of him. And so it just made me. He's back at home now. He spent quite a bit of time in the hospital, but I don't know how much longer he's going to be, like, she's going to be able to care for him at the house, because she's not in good health. And so we're having to make some difficult decisions as a family, and that documentary today really reinforced all of the things that we've been dealing with for the past several years. Watching him, he had to relearn how to talk and walk and eat. So it's been a pretty difficult situation, to say the least.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's a lot of this material, even throughout, especially with some of the childhood stuff. It's, it can really resonate. It can feel really familiar, and kind of even mirror, what we're experiencing in our own lives, which kind of just reinforces the importance of what we're looking at and what we're studying. So, thank you for sharing that. It reminds me that one of the things I thought was so striking about the documentary was the doctors articulated this gray area that so many of us, unless you're faced with that, kind of like you're saying, some of those decisions get so hard and they're unexpected and you're not ready for them. And we also don't really talk about them as a society or as a culture. It's not like we sit down and everybody says, let's talk about these really hard things and end of life decisions. Until you're really faced with that, you don't always talk about it. And so the doctors in the film talked about how we are faced because of the advances with medical care, medical treatment, and because doctors are trained to assess, identify, treat, and cure. There's really no cure for dying. There's no cure for old age, but there's all of these cures for these things like pneumonia or a broken hip or these isolated events. But how do we actually treat those within this larger frame of someone is really getting on in years, has really limited quality of life, limited will to live even sometimes. And so how are we guided when those lines are so blurry? How are we guided to make ethical decisions? Or how do we even, do we even talk about what our family values are? And they really talked about how families struggle with this idea that it's okay to not treat this specific illness like pneumonia because the Parkinson's is really the larger issue. And so that may eventually kind of be that natural cause of death. But if we continue to treat all these things and putting a trachea or putting in a feeding tube, it's going to extend their life, but then they're only going to die with these big kind of medicalized catastrophes. So these decisions just get harder and harder and harder. And I really appreciated that they looked at that and addressed that issue squarely in the eye. So do y'all have any thoughts about that? Or was there anything about that you thought was sort of confusing or had questions about? Or
I have a personal experience that kind of related to that. My grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and stage 4 lung cancer around the same time. And my mom had this fit about trying to make her stop smoking. She was still smoking cigarettes. And my grandmother's doctor actually told her she's 82. She has Alzheimer's. Let her smoke. It's not going to hurt her any more now than, trying to treat the cancer and all. They decided not to do any treatment for any of that because it would have hurt the rest of the years that she had instead of helping,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they are more inclined to think about the entire person when it comes to old age, and a lot of those treatments just aren't worth the trouble that they'd have to go through.
Right, exactly. Kind of what is the quality of the life of the last few years that you're going to have? Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the other things, go ahead.
That was Kendria. One of the things I struggled with this morning when I watched it, I could listen to it, but I had a hard time watching it. So I had it on my computer and I was listening to, I couldn't watch it. But I actually, a couple of years ago, I have a DNR for myself, even though I was like 20 something, because I do struggle with what you were saying, the idea of, I feel like I can make the decision for myself. I feel bad about other people having to make the decisions for me or doing that for someone else. But I, for myself, feel I don't want to, torture people, I guess. Yeah. So I have one and stayed with my doctor just because I was just like, my family, so I really struggle with that area of what is legal, what is right. Like, how do you, I don't know, someone doesn't put it in for themselves, what do you do?
Right. And what's right for you is not going to be what's right for somebody else. So, I mean,
Right.
remember that there was a couple of those examples highlighted in the documentary where the one woman, I think her name was Gina, I could be wrong. She said, you know, my kids want me to sign this DNR essentially, but I want them to suffer. Like people,
Yeah.
you know, that one just kind of made me laugh. But, you know, she had a very clear intention there. She said, no, you know, I'm going to live. I'm, you know, a general optimist. And, you know, things kind of worked out for her in that regard. And it doesn't sound like, you know, she really suffered at the end, but, you know, so that was right. What was right for her was that, you know, I'm making this decision. I'm not going to sign this for you. And, you know, that's just going to be the way that it is. But that's not everybody's right. So it doesn't make sense to legislate something like that or to have a policy that says everybody has to have a living will or everybody has to have one of those, you know, advanced directives or something like that. So there definitely are a lot of policy implications in this that we'll kind of talk throughout this evening about. One thing that also you reminded me, Kendria, is this whole idea of just like it's hard to watch. And I was really struck, you know, I've seen this documentary many times at this point. But this time, one of the things that really struck me was this idea of institutionalization and how it compares to you know, our institutions like our nursing homes and assisted living facilities with older people and the criminal justice system. In a way, it's this, there is a bit of a parallel, you could think, you know, just putting this out there, food for thought, that it's a little bit of this out of sight, out of mind. You know, we put people in homes or we, and there's even some shame around that. We feel like something's wrong with me or I don't have the resources to take care of this person, so I've got to put them in a home. And then it's very much like they're away and we can go on about our daily business and we know that they're basically cared for and we don't really have to think about it. So all of that stuff that you were saying is so hard to watch. It's really hard for a lot of people to watch. And so we do have this system of kind of putting people away, you know? And so I was really struck by that. Do you all have any thoughts about that? Did anybody else draw similar parallels or does anybody have any pushback on that?
I would just say, I thought it was interesting that some people embrace it from a social standpoint because, I mean, that was one of the things in the older adulthood chapter was that they have a tendency to get very lonely and to not socialize. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess that would be more of a positive way to look at it for the people who are embracing it and socializing and participating in activities versus being alone at home with, you know, a hospice worker and maybe no family.
Mm-hmm. Or being in an institution, but there just isn't this kind of vibrancy that you saw with some people. And I think one of the physicians, they said that somebody called it the waiting room and we're all just sort of waiting here to die. So it's, you know, there is kind of some pros and cons. And there are absolutely some upsides for the socialization piece. And actually a majority of our slides really are focused on that. So let me kind of jump in. Are there any other thoughts on the documentary before I jump into the slides? All right, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here. So we're not going to go over all of these. We'll still, you know, we'll go to about 6:30. I do want to watch this video really quickly. It's only about 4 minutes. So we'll watch this and then chat about it.
Never in human history have so many lived so long. Data suggests that if we reach 65 years of age, it's likely we'll live to 85. We're living longer and we're having fewer babies.
The aging society is about the fact that you have larger proportions of people over the age of 60 than you have who are under the age of 15.
And it's not just America that's an aging society. Europe, China, Japan, we're an aging globe. An aging society isn't just about old people. It's not just about baby boomers. Gen X will likely live longer, and so will millennials.
The baby boomers are an introduction to what will be a permanent shift. It is not the pig and the python, the large snake that swallows a pig, and you see that bulge going through the snake and then coming out the other end eventually. Well, ours never comes out the other end. This is a permanent state we're now in a remarkable shift.
And the shift will utterly transform our society. How and how long we work, how and where we live, how we organize our families, medical care, economic and political lives, how we organize our thinking. This will give you an idea of what's ahead. Right now, about half of us live in the suburbs, and it's where 75% of older Americans live and want to continue to live. But suburbs were designed in the 1950s for young families, and the car. There's a disconnect there we have to deal with.
It's an old rule of thumb that if you can make the community work for kids, and if you can make the community work for the elderly, that it will work for everyone else.
Same with how we work. We think of 65 as a retirement age engraved in stone. But when Social Security was enacted in 1935, average life expectancy was only 62, 3 years less than retirement age. Today, we can expect to live about 15 years beyond traditional retirement age.
There isn't anything in the psychology literature that suggests that it's good for people to go on vacation for decades.
Even if it were a good thing, few of us imagine retirement as a vacation anymore. Most of us haven't saved enough, and we're all worried, for good reason, about Social Security and Medicare. What if we reimagined our standard life course? We think of it now in 3 age-segregated boxes. Age 0 to maybe 25, childhood and education. Age 25 to 65, work, and more of it. Raising a family, always crunched for time. Age 65 and beyond, little work, lots of rest. What if we imagined that that third box would start just 3 years before life expectancy today, say around 75, not 65? What if we worked less in the middle of life and longer at the end? And what if we looked at aging and even our own mortality square in the eye?
Children in American society historically have only suffered losses that relate to their parents for the most part. But today and tomorrow, they're going to suffer the losses of great-grandparents, of parents, of grandparents, and so on.
So here's the point. The world we live in, the people we've become, demographically speaking, are way different from 1935 or 1950 or even 1970. But our institutions, economies, policies, Social Security, Medicare, our communities, work, all were designed for who we were 50 years ago. They don't work for us today. So, are there rough waters ahead?
When we think about an aging society, everybody swoons. Oh my God. You know, they write articles about defusing the demographic time bomb. Why is there an assumption there is no upside?
Maybe because the upside requires change. Change we have to design, legislate, wrap our heads around.
As a psychologist, I'll tell you the very first step that is really essential, and that's that we begin to envision new models, new ways of being, new lives. How will we come of age in an aging America? The conversation begins. Just that it's good for
You know,
people
they write
to
articles
vacation
about
for
defusing the demographic.
Okay, so that's a very different look at what we are thinking about when kind of what we saw in the old documentary, the aging documentary. So what are some thoughts about that? Did anybody know that when the Social Security Act was passed in 1935 that it was based on a life expectancy 3 years prior to typical retirement age?
I knew that, but just because of my economics class. When I was in high school, my economics teacher covered quite a bit of that.
Mm-hmm.
But not from the standpoint of we should, try to, use our life longer, just from a standpoint of, hey, you should probably save your money because,
Right. But there are some really interesting policy implications for this, you know, related to this, which is actually one of the reasons why we are focusing on that a little bit more in this unit than some of the previous units, is that the changes are so intense to this population. You saw that for the first time, people over the age of 85 is the fastest growing subpopulation in the United States. That's not insignificant. And you can even see that here in this demographic of the 65 and older age groups. They share the total population will rise to nearly 24% from 15%. And when you think about that proportionally, that makes a huge difference. At 15%, you know, there's only going to be some people affected. At almost 25%, you're talking about a quarter of the population, which means that just about every single person is going to know someone over the age of 65 or be, you know, impacted by that in some way. So how we're treating this population, how this population is affecting the rest of us becomes very, very, I mean, it's always important, but it becomes extremely important when you look at this type of demographic shift, especially with resources. We know that people who are aging tend to be sicker. We know that that's going to be more taxing on our healthcare systems, which are going to impact everybody else. So I thought that video was interesting, that it showed the differences, how our systems today were based on the way that life looked in the 30s and in the 50s and even in the 70s. And that's not how America looks now in a variety of areas. So did you all catch that piece, or was there anything else from that video that you were struck by?
The one thing that stood out to me is the fact that so many seniors live in the suburbs. Mm-hmm. So, like, my parents live in a suburb in Florida, and it makes me nervous when I think about them getting to the point where they're not going to be able to drive any longer, because they'll be so much more isolated than if they were in more of an urban setting where they could, you know, walk to places and walk to get their groceries. And that's something that concerns me. And I don't live in the same state as them, and neither does my sister. So that's going to be a huge, like, issue for our family.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in a reality for so many people. Yeah, I mean, my parents just went through a big downsizing thing just this week, and it was all exciting because they're now on one floor. So that's just even within, you know, a household. So, you know, let alone what's going on just kind of in the neighborhood that they're in and things like that. So, because if you live in a suburb and you are unable to drive, your entire world shrinks really, really quickly. So, really, really important. So kind of moving on, there are some other issues to be aware of with regard to, you know, racially and ethnically diverse populations. As our country became more racially and ethnically diverse, you know, based on, you know, immigration laws and things like that happened kind of during the mid-century in the 20th century. That has long-term implications for as those people age. So that also means that our older adult population is becoming more diverse as well. Also, the way that we work is interesting. The education levels of the elderly are rising, and older adults are working longer, just like you saw in that video. There's also some shifts in the makeup of the labor force between men and women. Some of that is you can kind of, you know, expect from when you think about that in 1966, you know, there weren't as many women in the workforce as there are now. So, you know, you would kind of expect that number to change as people aged. Also, this is a really interesting piece down here. Is the average U.S. life expectancy increase from 68 in 1950 to 79 in 2013. So that is a huge difference. And remember, it was 62 back in 1935. So in less than 100 years, it's gone from 62 to almost 80. So this is a huge difference, and kind of goes into now why people are expected to be in retirement. If you think of 65 as retirement age, you know, for 15 years, sometimes longer. So that's a lot more to plan for, especially from a financial standpoint and from a policy standpoint than if, the average life expectancy was 68. The gender gap is shrinking a little bit as well. It used to be 7 years between men and women, and now it's 5 years. It's kind of unclear where that shift is really happening or why. There's probably some guesses that we could have. Do any of y'all have some thoughts about why that might be? Why that gap between men and women may be shrinking? No thoughts? No guesses? Do you think it could be because of the amount of stress that women are experiencing now that they might be working for longer and raising families? Maybe men are going to the doctor more than they used to and getting preventative care where they didn't used to, so they might be living a little bit longer, so it might kind of be shrinking on both sides. So don't have a definitive answer about that, but it is something to be aware of. The poverty rate for Americans is also changing. And this is really interesting. This is actually a good thing for sure, is that in the last 50 years, it has dropped from 30% in 1966 to 10% today. So any thoughts about why that poverty rate might be decreasing for this population?
Is it because they have better access to like resources? Maybe things like, for instance, like SNAP programs. Are there more programs available?
Yeah,
available to them?
Yeah, it could be programs. What do you think about that whole issue of women in the workforce? What do you think that might have to do with saving money?
Oh, so now we have two people in the household bringing income. That's what it is.
Something to think about. Again, we don't have with kind of large scale data like this, we don't necessarily, trend data is really hard to pinpoint a specific reason and of course there's probably multiple factors that contribute to this. But when you look at especially just look at the date, you might think that now you might have in 1995 or even 2015, you're going to have, you might have two people bringing in Social Security income or pensions or, having 401ks and retirement, contributing to the household as opposed to just one, supporting two people. So that might have a real impact on the poverty rate. I'm not sure that that's the only reason, but that was one of the things that sort of jumped out for me, especially as it relates to the, just the time frame and the gender changes of gender roles that we've seen in our culture in the last 50 years.
I know for my grandmother who relied on state assistance towards the end of her life, she was able to have access to SNAP benefits as well as she lived in like not a nursing home, but kind of like an assisted living facility. And especially for those who had limited mobility, they were, and this may be exclusive to Kentucky, I'm not sure if it's programs that are implemented across the country, but they had this program that was income-based called Meals on Wheels.
Oh, yeah.
And they would deliver meals to seniors with low income and usually limited mobility or zero transportation. So that could also contribute to decreasing poverty experiences among seniors.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably in the different access to benefits. I mean, there may, in 1965, the kind of war on poverty, we had a big legislation there that created a lot of entitlement programs under the Johnson administration. So some of that difference may actually be policy related. So that's a good point about all of the different benefits that are available. And even things like Medicare, we didn't used to have, Medicare didn't used to look the way that it looks now and be able to actually, provide support for healthcare costs for people over the age of 65. And healthcare costs become a huge percentage of people's, monthly expenditures on on a personal level. So that makes a big difference. So kind of jumping ahead, another important factor is economic disparities across different populations. So with regard to race, this disparity, we've kind of seen this with health outcomes. We've seen it with economic outcomes kind of across the lifespan. So this is not something that is perhaps surprising, but, you know, is helpful to know that essentially more than that non-Hispanic whites have basically half of the poverty rate as do African Americans and Latinos. So it is double for our people of color in the United States, which is definitely a concerning disparity and something to be aware of moving forward, because that might have, you know, kind of thinking about the societal implications for these statistics, or, you know, what does this mean for things like access to healthcare and, you know, where you live and proximity to services and, entitlement programs or other insurance benefits and things like that. So what are some other implications that you all can think of from these changing demographics? How does this specifically relate to social work practice, would you say?
I don't know how it relates specifically to social work practice, but I was thinking about our society moving towards more socialized medicine and the contraindications that might have for the older population, as far as how much money we're willing to spend on the older population. And I don't know what that looks like. I was just kind of wondering if that might impact how much we would allocate toward that age group.
You know, I think that's a really good point. Sometimes it's about who's making the laws, and that's one of the reasons I was so interested in this demographic change from the 15% of the population is over 65 to 24% is over 65, which means, you know, it's right there. We can't really escape that issue or that need, and so I do feel like there's going to be changes in our system just simply because there has to be. But I also know that when you just kind of look at how laws are made and things like that, it's, you know, it's not always those changes aren't always good. Sometimes those changes mean that the people who have means just get more and the people who don't have means just get less. So that I'm very interested to see how some of that shakes out moving forward.
Well, I think you kind of just answered the question in terms of like what would be the possible implications for social work, because if you're thinking about it at a macro level, like policy and advocacy is kind of like the main focus. So I mean, if we're dealing with an increase in a specific population and dealing with having to figure out how to care for these people, I know like in a lot of these senior care facilities, they have social workers who were like patient care advocates, and they kind of collaborate with other social workers or other types of services to say, hey, this is what we're facing and this is what we need help with, and you know, we've got to try to find funding for it. And that can be done, you know, typically at a state level and essentially at a federal level.
Yeah, and that's a huge, you know, advocacy, like you're saying, you know, policy change advocacy is a huge role for social workers, especially as it relates to those social justice issues that we care so deeply about that do impact vulnerable populations, and older adults are squarely in that vulnerable populations, you know, kind of category for sure. So, yeah, so really, really good points. Any other thoughts about that, implications? You know, sometimes one thing that I learned from being in state government for so long was that sometimes when the budget is really, really strapped, people get really, really creative and innovative and really find some exciting ways to use very limited funds and resources. And one of the things that I saw, I thought that I had posted it, but it could be that I just saw it and didn't post it. But there was a documentary that I saw somewhat recently that was it featured a kind of I guess it was a nursing home, but it seemed like the people were more mobile than like some of the nursing home segments that we saw in the documentary. And they had integrated preschools into the older adult facility so that the older adults could take care of the very young children. And it was this really beautiful example of how everybody's needs were getting met. The older adults were socialized, they were around, I mean, who doesn't, it's kind of hard to be sad when you're around lots of, happy babies and things like that. So there was that piece that helped had really positive outcomes for the preschoolers as well as the older adults. And then on top of that, they had this example where in the same facility, they had kind of emerging adults, like young adults, live there and serve as kind of RAs, like residential assistants on the different floors. And so they kind of checked in on the people who lived there. And, there was lots of social interaction between those folks. So you kind of had this 3-generation kind of intentional living community all in this one building. And the young people who worked there, they got to live there. That was sort of how they paid their rent. It was kind of like community service. So they contributed so many hours per week, and then that paid their rent. And obviously it's hard to afford housing when you're really young and just starting out. And so it seemed like this great opportunity to just help every single kind of stage of life. I thought that was really interesting. So I'm interested to see how this kind of shakes out over time, as I said before.
They actually do that a lot here in Japan, and specifically in Okinawa, which is where we live, because they have some of the they have like the highest rate for like the oldest population, like on a global scale.
Right. Like lots of people, the most people over 100, right?
Yeah. And so that's what they started doing, is they designed these facilities that accommodate preschools as well as seniors. And it's this really neat kind of like collaborative, interaction between like these little guys and these really, really old people. So, it's helpful. I think it's a great model, and I wish that we would have had that like when my grandmother was living in like assisted living.
Yeah. I think it's great. Did you see I'll digress for a second. Did you see the documentary Happy, or did anybody see that? Happy. It was from 2011. I think you can get it on Netflix.
Was it about Okinawa and
They actually feature, it was a very global look at happiness, and they cited a lot of happiness research, and it's a really great documentary. And they looked at Okinawa because the population there, they just were saying that they have this really high kind of happiness quotient. And part of it was because of the social interactions that they had. Like, they lived so long, so they had all this longevity, but then what was the quality of life? And they found that it was, basically pretty good. And they showed all of these clips of these parades that I guess these people had from town to town to town, because it was saying and so they got all these young people between the ages of 20 and 30. You could only be between 20 and 30, and you just were kind of the entertainment. And so they had everybody sitting outside and watching these parades go by.
They do. They have tons of festivals, and it's usually like on a weekly basis, but it really like, it's the whole island. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen so many significantly elderly people so active in their community as I have since moving here. So it was really neat to see that, but then it also kind of like made me really sad because it's like, why isn't this happening anywhere else?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great question and one to really, really sit with, because, and another reason why I think it's really important to not look at these really important issues through that ethnocentric lens is we need to see how other people are doing it, so we don't make these assumptions that it has to be a certain way. So I appreciate that, the examples from Japan, Hillary, that's great. Okay, so I want to just make sure I cover just a few other really important things. One of the critical things, and like I said, we've kind of alluded to it already, is this whole issue of social isolation and social interaction. As it turns out, there are really important this piece is really important to cognitive functioning and cognitive decline in old age. So when you think about if you're working with an older adult, or you're working with a family member who's caring for an older adult, this kind of assessing for this social isolation piece is really, really important. And one of the reasons is that there's some really negative associations with a lack of social, or with social isolation and a lack of that kind of human connection. And so things like increased risk for cardiovascular disease, increased risk for infectious diseases and cognitive deterioration and inflammation, and heightened inflammatory and metabolic responses to stress. And it really reminds me that we talk a lot about how the environment impacts development when we're younger, but we sort of trail off and don't necessarily focus on that so much as people get old, because we're not as focused on like developing, strong neural connections and brain architecture and all of that stuff that we talked about all semester. But it really is just as important for overall quality of life and cognitive performance. The social interaction piece is really mission critical. So it's really something to remember to assess for and make sure that that's really a factor in our work with older adults. So I'm going to jump ahead just let me see. One P. Okay. So this will be the last piece that I focus on. Well, maybe one more after this. So the importance of social relationships and social interaction are absolutely critical to brain health. And there is a very kind of basic, physiological and cognitive reason for that. And so, as we've been talking just on this, in this class today, I've said something and you have heard what I've said, you focused on what I've said, you've remembered the topic that I've been speaking about, and then you've responded. And you've done that all without thinking. It's just completely ingrained and natural. You're not even realizing that actually in order for us to have this effective interaction, that we have to pay attention to each other. We have to maintain in memory the topic of the conversation and respective contributions. So what did one student say, and what did I say, and what did the other student say in response to the other student, and all of these things that go back and forth that we don't even think about. Things like adapting to each other's perspectives, inferring each other's beliefs and desires, something we don't even talk about, but we make lots of kind of critical assumptions about, that both add to the conversation or inhibit conversation, for things like inhibiting irrelevant or inappropriate behavior. We also, when we're having a dialogue, we assess the situational constraints, acting on, both of the people. And so all of this goes on without us really thinking about it. It's just kind of this simple exchange. But if any one of these factors cognitively that, are impacted, it really dramatically reduces our ability to have effective communication. So we know that all of these things like working memory and attention, ability to focus, they're all controlled by our, executive functions in our prefrontal cortex, and thinking about all of these kind of higher ordered thinking. So if we lose something like the ability to pay attention, it's going to really inhibit our ability to socially interact. If we lose our short-term memory, anybody who's ever talked to somebody who's lost their short-term memory will remember. It's sort of like 50 First Dates, that movie. You know, you just can't, the person will just constantly repeat themselves or ask you the same question over and over again, because they cannot, even for a short period of time, hold the memory of the conversation, which means that you're not really going to have a meaningful conversation with them, which can create all kinds of things and issues within the relationship there. So what happens is that we know now that cognitive functioning actually stimulates social interaction, and that in turn, this social interaction, this kind of bidirectional dialogue that we're having, it then stimulates further cognitive functioning, which then stimulates further social interaction. So it's this kind of constant feedback loop that is really, really, really important for our brain functioning, and can help our folks who are aging keep their brains, fresh and functioning and not deteriorating. And one of the things that some of your readings talked about is this idea of, we know that neuroplasticity, we know that our brains are plastic and can change, throughout the life course. But as we learned in middle adulthood, our brains are excited to things that are challenging, that are new. So if you're constantly around the same people, or you're constantly in the same environment, your brain isn't stimulated in the same way because nothing's new. You're not really learning anything. So it's not stimulating your brain in the same way that it would if you were, say, moved into an assisted living facility and had to meet a whole bunch of new people and experience new things and have new conversations with people that you don't know like the back of your hand, like your kids or your siblings or something like that. So this becomes a really important piece to understand about aging. And in fact, we know that social interaction is critical for young people as well. And in the Ibarra article that is posted on Canvas talked about the amount of social interaction being predicted of cognitive functioning in the elderly, but also in younger participants, social interaction was as effective as intellectual activities in boosting cognitive performance. So just the simple act of having conversations with people and interacting with people in just a social way has a direct positive impact on cognitive performance. So when you might interact with an older adult in a social work setting and identify that they are very socially isolated and they have very limited social interaction, that should be a very clear red flag for you to start thinking about, okay, what can we do to change this? It's also the reason that that studies have shown some older adults really thrive in those more institutional type settings like a nursing home or an assisted living facility, because they are challenged and, meet all these new people. And so that sometimes you might have worse outcomes if the person stays at home and is surrounded by family, which is oftentimes what people want, but cognitively speaking, may not be the best choice for everyone. So something to really remember. So there's a link to a little video. We won't watch it now, but you can access it on the PowerPoint posted on Canvas. But one last thing I want to finish up with is this whole idea of elder speak. And this is something that most likely we all have done. So it's just understanding, no judgment here right now, but it is really something to be aware of, because it's something that we might sort of naturally do, just sort of like when we're interacting with babies, we all have this sort of, baby talk thing that we kind of naturally do, but it's not appropriate when working with older adults to when you are interacting with them socially, to kind of drop into this elder speak. And elder speak looks like, speaking more slowly, which may seem like a good idea because you think, oh, well, cognitively they're not all there, or they may have some issues, so I'm going to speak more slowly. You might think that that's kind of a respectful thing, but it actually can make comprehension harder. Doing things like using limited vocabulary can kind of insult their intelligence. So they're not a child. They've had an entire lifetime of using big words or using a variety of vocabulary words. And so if you start limiting them, you're not stimulating their brain. Repeating or paraphrasing what has just been said it might imply that they don't understand what you're saying. Using terms like honey and dear obviously can be condescending. Some people might just think they're being nice, but it's something to watch out for. And using statements that sound like questions can be really confusing. So we know that elder speak is harmful for reasons like I've just said, but some additional ones are that it implies a person is not competent when in fact they very well may be. It can also affect an older person's evaluation of their own abilities. So, you might think, well, if this person's talking to me like I'm a child, like maybe I really am not as all there as I thought I was. It can also reinforce negative stereotypes about aging and erode older adults' self-esteem. So just something to be cognizant of if you are working with this population. And I've kind of already said all this, but it can be confusing when a word is exaggerated. It can be hard to understand a statement that sounds like a question. And kind of going back to that issue about kind of working memory and maintaining focus, if you're talking too slowly, it might actually affect a person's ability to kind of stay on point and retain that information, really follow the conversation. So there's kind of a balance that needs to be achieved when you're working with folks. And obviously there's going to be some things like you might actually need to speak up if someone's hearing is deteriorated or something like that. So so that piece is important as well. So to kind of sum up, we really did talk some about the implications for social work, but just to remind you all that the social policy piece cannot be understated. There are factors that need to be considered when you look at living arrangements and how to make those decisions. You definitely always want to be promoting some type of social interaction. It really is about quality. It's also about quantity, simply for variety's sake. And communication styles like elder speaker are really important to consider. So I'm going to stop there. It is right about 6:30, right on the nose. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So are there any, before we finish up, are there any questions or thoughts about what we covered tonight?
I don't really have anything right now.
Okay, great. Well, I will go ahead and finish up. Well, before I stop recording, are there any last questions just about course expectations or kind of finishing out the semester? I'll reiterate how important it is to finish up the course evaluation, which is open today. And then also the final quiz 5, which I know some of you have already taken, but is due this coming Sunday, which is after Thanksgiving, obviously, this coming Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. So please, please, please do not forget that. So some of you have 2 assignments to do this week. Way to put on the pressure. Hopefully you'll get through. Are there any other questions about anything related to the course?
Where will we find the evaluation?
You will get a separate email, not from me, that has a link, but I will also post the link in the announcements page, so you should get it directly through your email. So I'll do that sometime soon before the end date or before the due date.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
My CTE, my individual CTE on the grade just has like the yellow flag. Yeah. But there's no grade. Is that normal?
Oh, yeah. They just haven't been graded yet. They
Okay.
haven't been graded. And the yellow and the green, I have, because again, this is the first time I've used Canvas. I think that actually has something to do with the percentage of match through our kind of plagiarism check. So I wouldn't forget about that. But I think that that's what the colors, because some are blue, some are yellow, some are green. So I haven't quite ascertained what those different colors mean yet. But just know that I do a manual check of all of those, and I don't just look at a number and say that's plagiarism. I look, it gives us a report, and I look through each of those things, and most of the time it's because I have the same readings, and so one of the papers is already in the system, and so it's matching up. Like the reference page is typically what it is, but I'll let you know if there's any problems. But you will see a grade in there before December 19th. Any other questions? All right. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed having each of you in class this semester. I may have many of you in class for leadership next semester. I'm looking forward to that, which it'll be a completely different vibe as this semester, much less intense. It's only 2 credit hours, much more reflective. So if you need anything, I will, still be around. So feel free to contact me via email is the best way to get a hold of me. And I will let you know, I'll follow up with you via email if there's any issues. All right. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.